Thank you, Mr. President. I rise this afternoon to speak about Amendment 4012. I want to thank my co-sponsors, Senators Sessions, Vitter, Cotton, and Inhofe. This amendment addresses a very serious public safety threat, and that is the threat posed by sanctuary cities. This is a problem, Mr. President, that's not a theoretical abstraction. It's a problem that some Americans know all too well. One father in particular. On July 1st, 2015, just last year, Jim Steinle was walking arm in arm with his daughter Kate on a pier in San Francisco. A gunman opened fire, hit Kate, and within moments she died in her father's arms. Her last words were, "Help me, Dad." Now, what's maddening about this, Mr. President, is the shooter should have never been on the pier that day in the first place. He was an illegal immigrant. Here, illegally, he had been convicted of 7 felonies, and he'd been deported 5 times. But it gets worse. Just 3 months prior to his shooting and killing Kate Steinle, the San Francisco police had him in custody. They had him in custody. Federal immigration officials knew that the San Francisco police had him in custody. They knew that he was here illegally, in violation of multiple deportations, a violent criminal convicted on multiple occasions. And so they said, hold him till we get somebody there to pick him up and deport him. But the police refused to hold him. Instead, they released the shooter out into the public. Why did they do that? Because San Francisco is a sanctuary city. And that means that they are a city that specifically, and by law within the city, they forbid their police from cooperating with federal immigration officials, even when the police want to cooperate. It's against the law in the city to do so. Now, the local police and President Obama's administration, they agree that with respect to a dangerous person, the federal and local law enforcement authorities ought to cooperate. But the local politicians, in San Francisco in this case, have overridden that judgment. And so the police, who had every opportunity to prevent this man from being on the pier that night, instead released him. He went on to kill Kate Steinle. As a father of 3 young children, I can't even imagine the pain that family has gone through. But, Mr. President, sadly, the Steinles are not alone. According to the Department of Homeland Security, our current administration's Department of Homeland Security, during an 8-month period that they examined last year alone, sanctuary city jurisdictions released over 8,000 illegal immigrants, and 1,800 of them later were arrested for criminal acts. It included 2 cities that arrested individuals who had been arrested. They released individuals who had been arrested for child sex abuse, and in both cases, the individuals released later sexually assaulted other children again. You know, you'd think that in the wake of these tragedies, you'd think elected officials across America would end this practice of having these dangerous sanctuary city policies. Sadly, that is not the case. In the biggest city in my state by far, Philadelphia, they've taken the opposite approach. In fact, they've imposed one of the most extreme versions of sanctuary cities anywhere in America. 2 weeks ago, the current President Obama's Secretary of Homeland Security visited Philadelphia for the specific purpose of trying to persuade the city government to make a little tiny exception to their sanctuary city policy. Here's what he wanted. He wanted to change the policy so that the Philadelphia police would be able to notify federal immigration officials that they're about to release from their custody a person here if the person has been convicted of a violent felony or convicted of a crime involving a gang, or he's a suspected terrorist. The mayor of Philadelphia refused. So even under those circumstances, the police of Philadelphia are forbidden from cooperating and sharing that, even just the information, with federal immigration officials. So what are the kinds of consequences for this? Well, consider the case of Alberto Suarez. In 2010, Alberto Suarez kidnapped and raped a girl from Montgomery County, which is just outside of Philadelphia. He bragged to the girl that the police would never be able to catch him because he's here illegally. 5 months later, he kidnapped a 22-year-old woman from a Philadelphia bus stop and he raped her. Now, he's been apprehended. He's pleaded guilty. He's awaiting sentencing, but someday he's going to be released. And under the current Philadelphia city policy of being a sanctuary city, the police cannot inform federal immigration officials when they're releasing him. This is ridiculous. Or imagine that the Philadelphia police have in their custody an illegal immigrant whom the FBI suspects of plotting a terrorist attack. The Department of Homeland Security might very reasonably ask the police, hold on to him till we can get an agent down there, take him into custody, and ask him some questions, because we suspect that he's involved with a terrorist plot. The Philadelphia police response, not by their choice, but the response by virtue of Philadelphia being a sanctuary city, to the federal official, come back again after he's actually committed the terrorist act and been convicted of it, and then we'll see if we can help you. This, Mr. President, makes no sense at all. So it's no wonder that leaders across the political spectrum, this is not a partisan thing. This policy has been criticized by former Philadelphia mayor, former Pennsylvania governor, and Democrat Ed Rendell. It's been criticized by President Obama's Secretary of Homeland Security, Pennsylvania law enforcement officials across the political spectrum. And let me be very, very clear. This is not principally about immigration. It's really not about immigration at all. It's about violent and dangerous criminals. Everybody knows, I certainly know, the vast majority of immigrants are never going to commit a violent crime. It isn't about them. It's about the fact that if you have any significant population, and certainly 11 million people here illegally, some subset of that population will be violent criminals. We know that. And so, Mr. President, I've got an amendment. It's modeled on a bill that the Senate voted on last October. It was supported by a bipartisan majority of senators in that vote. And it deals with this problem. And here's what it does. It says, first of all, there's an I won't say legitimate, but an understandable reason why some communities have become sanctuary communities, and that's because a court decision has created a legal liability for the cities if they, at the request of the Department of Homeland Security, detain someone who later turns out to have been the wrong person. Well, that legal liability has scared a number of communities. It's understandable, and so this amendment changes that. It makes it clear that when the local officer, the local police are in compliance with the Department of Homeland Security detainer request, the local police have the same authority as the Department of Homeland Security, and if that person has been identified wrongly, then the liability still exists. The person, if their civil rights have been violated, they can sue, but the liability is with the Department of Homeland Security, as it should be, and not against the local law enforcement who are simply acting on behalf, temporarily, of the Department of Homeland Security. Having corrected that problem, if this amendment passes, what we say is, if you want to nevertheless be a sanctuary city and refuse to allow the local police to cooperate with federal immigration officials, then we're going to withhold community development block grant funds from such a community. These are the funds, as you know, that have great discretion in the hands of local elected officials to spend on various projects. The fact is, sanctuary cities impose a very real cost for the federal government, a real cost. The most important cost by far is the danger to society that it imposes, and so it's entirely reasonable for the federal government to withhold some of these grants in the event that a city chooses to inflict that cost on the rest of us. Mr. President, this legislation is endorsed by the Federal Law Enforcement Officers Association, the National Sheriff's Association, the National Association of Police Organizations, the International Union of Police Associations, which is a division of the AFL-CIO. It's a simple, common sense amendment, and it stands for the simple principle that the safety of the American people matters. The life of Kate Steinle matters. Now, let me just, right up front, I want to debunk some of the misinformation that is occasionally propagated about this amendment. One is the idea that, it would discourage people from coming forward and reporting crimes or reporting that they witnessed a crime or that they were a victim of crime, and therefore it's a bad idea. Well, the fact is, our legislation has been drafted in such a way that if a local community has a law that says local law enforcement shall not inquire about the immigration status of a crime victim or witness, according to our legislation, that doesn't make you a sanctuary city. So any city would still be free to offer that protection to people so that they would not have to fear deportation for disclosing a crime. Fact is, this amendment is germane. It was timely filed. It satisfies all of the relevant rules. This is the right venue, this is the right time, and this is the legislation to consider this. It's really time to stop with this political correct nonsense and being so worried that we can't offend anyone that we are going to risk the safety of our communities. And so, Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the pending amendment be set aside so that I may offer my amendment number 4012.
Mr. President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, reserving my right to object, the senator of Pennsylvania has very thoughtfully pointed out significant issues with respect to immigration law, with respect to public safety. But what I believe is that the remedy of cutting off CDBG funding is not the appropriate response to these very serious problems. Indeed, CDBG funding is available throughout the nation to large communities, small communities, and in many cases it provides support for public safety projects, infrastructure that protects people, and on and on and on. So with all due respect to the Senator of Pennsylvania, I would object to making the amendment pending at this time.
The objection is heard.
Mr. President.
Senator from Pennsylvania.
I just have to say, with all due respect to my friend and colleague from Rhode Island, this is exactly what Americans are so fed up with. There is a real problem out there, a real problem with public safety. They know it. This is a ridiculous and indefensible policy, but I'm willing to have a debate about it. I did not ask for unanimous consent that my amendment be adopted. I asked for consent that we debate it and have a vote. And if a majority of senators disagrees with me, then I don't know why they can't come down here and cast a vote and let us know. It's germane. It's in order. It complies with all the rules. And the status quo means dangerous criminals are being released onto our streets. That's a fact. I'll tell you what's going on here. We have colleagues who are afraid to cast a vote. They are afraid of having to make a choice. They're afraid that if they vote with me to put pressure on cities to end sanctuary cities, it's going to offend some people. They don't want to do that. But if they vote against it, they know they're endangering their own constituents. They don't want their constituents to know that. So rather than standing up and making a decision, what do? They say, let's not allow the debate. Let's not allow the amendment. This is exactly what the American people are so fed up with, Mr. President. But I'm not giving up on this. This is a very, very important issue. We have a responsibility to be stewards of the money that we give these cities. And I think the vast majority of Pennsylvanians, the people that I represent, they want me to be a steward that's looking after their safety. The status quo doesn't do that. This amendment would solve a very important problem. It is outrageous that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle are afraid to have this debate, afraid to go on record, afraid to let their constituents know whether they support sanctuary cities or not. And we're not finished with this, Mr. President. I yield the floor.